we're going to be talking about the exteriors, meaning to say, basically, the topic of this class is from the outside in. That's the name of this class today, from the outside in. So, Rod, if you're out there, name of this class is from the outside to the inside. Why am I discussing this topic today? This week's Torah portion is discussing the vestments, the clothing worn by the priests. We begin first with the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. At that time, it was Aaron. And then the garments, they call the vestments of the priest, which was at that time Aaron's sons, which continued to be Aaron's sons, but at that time it was literally only his sons. So I guess, I was thinking about how can this, in what way does this relate to Noahide? In what way does this relate to all of us? And as it's pointed out in Chabad Hasidic thinking so many times, the Torah is eternal, and we don't have use of these commandments now. So what's the lesson? It must be that there is a spiritual counterpart of these commandments. And so even though they can't be carried out in their literal physical form, but their spiritual form can be carried out. Now, I'm not going to promise you to explain every detail of the meaning of that, but I was thinking, what is the spiritual counterpart of these vestments? And then it came to me, the answer was so obvious, but it's action. We're also going to speak just in general about the importance of clothing in general. Basically, it's really, this comes down to a fundamental idea in Judaism, is that you change yourself, as I said, from the outside in. In other words, with your mind, you act in a certain way, and that changes you by what you do, and including what you wear. In fact, I would say what you wear is a very important part of affecting who you are. Because, first of all, it's an act you do at every moment of your waking hours, or even sleeping hours, or wearing something. But particularly in our waking hours, what we dress is a form of a mitzvah that's continuous. As we spoke in weeks prior, that there are commandments of the mind and of the heart that are continuous. This is on the level of action, is something that's continuous. What you wear, if you dress in a modest fashion, if you dress in a fashion that symbolizes that I see myself as a servant of God, I see myself as a moral person, I see myself in a modest way, and that's reflected in my clothing. That's something you're doing at every moment. You're also making a statement, and it's a statement other people see. It's also very, very important. People really underestimate the importance of how we dress. When you dress, first of all, it communicates with others constantly. People see you and they react. They're reacting because our visual sight is so it makes such a deep impression on us, or it's a first impression for certain, but it actually makes quite an impression. We all know that. You see someone and you either like the way they look or don't, or just drawn to look at them more because of the way they look. We're physical, visual creatures. And so therefore, how we should use that visual power to do something good, to have a positive influence. Now, when people see us, they see modesty, a conservative form of dress. They see respect for, I guess, for traditional values. And they see that in the way you're dressed, right off the bat. Also, as I said, modesty, not to dress in a way that's, and I don't even mean in terms of, I mean to say in a way that is not pretentious, that is not, it doesn't show a brazenness. It's a little hard to explain, but a person can dress in a brazen way. It could have a sexual innuendo. It doesn't have to, but it generally does. But it's in a way that's, hey, look at me, and I'm pushing the envelope with the way I'm dressing against, and it's interesting because I think many people, and we can even within ourselves, can have a tendency to believe that acting in that way is a certain form of boldness, and I think it's true. It is, but unfortunately, it's a boldness of the other side. It's a boldness and a brazenness to go against the divine will and to do things that really, in the end of the day, are self-destructive and not positive, not good. When we make a statement of modesty, we're saying there's room for another person. This isn't just about my own self-expression. It's certainly not about my expression of my bodily feelings, passions on the way I'm dressing. And that's important. People see that. It makes an effect on them, if not consciously, subconsciously. But even more important than that, it makes an effect on you. I mean, to be honest, with me, myself, I have increased, I've dressed more conservative than I used to a couple of years ago. Because I take it when it doesn't have to be this way, but when I put on that white shirt, to me, it's like a message. Okay, you're a servant of God. The people are studying, Torah and Talmud. They're wearing a white shirt. I'm wearing the white shirt. In other words, I do it to make a statement for good, in terms of who I am, as opposed to maybe dressing in a more way that may be more office-like. I mean, and sometimes I do wear colored shirts for the office, but I generally don't wear that at home or in synagogue. Anyway, I do think what you're putting on, that makes a subliminal statement about who you are to yourself, and that's really the most important thing. So we learn in this Torah portion that if the priests failed to wear their vestments, they would be liable to the death penalty from heaven. No, well, let me explain why I didn't say that correctly. Not at all times, meaning when they're performing their service in the temple, or if they entered the temple, they needed to be wearing the priestly vestments. If they failed to do so, that was punished. That incurred the divine death penalty, not one that was carried out by human hands, but by heaven. So you see the extreme seriousness of wearing the clothing that you're supposed to. Obviously, it's disrespectful to go into the king's house and not dress appropriately. You're not going to go in your pajamas and bring offerings and so on and so forth. They had to wear the proper clothing. But there's also the deeper level. The deeper level is that every mitzvah is a clothing. According to the Zohar, in Hasidic thinking, the commandments are kind of like they're considered garments on the soul. The soul's garments are the mitzvahs that we do. They are actually the garment. What is a garment, really? It enhances us. It gives us more honor. It protects us from the cold or from the heat. And similarly, the commandments acts as a conduit in order for human beings to receive divine contact, divine light, divine enlightenment, etc., etc. Basically, the question is asked in Tanya: how can a soul, which, despite the fact that it's a divine thing, the godly soul, at least it's divine, how can it have a union with God, since the soul is limited and defined, and God is undefined? God is completely infinite. How can these two things meet? And the answer is through the Torah and the commandments. The Torah and commandments have that contradiction themselves. On the one hand, They're one with God. They're God's wisdom and will, and just similar to a person's wisdom and will are united with them to a certain extent. Although they're also separate within a person. Within God, they're one. God's will and His wisdom and Himself are a complete unity. So, if that's the case, the mitzvahs are God's will. The Torah is His wisdom. So you can ask me, well, wait a minute, what are you saying? Are you saying a four-cornered garment with fringes is God's will? Physical things in this talk, God's will is eternal. It should be beyond our ability to comprehend. So the answer is that these are kind of parables of the of God's wisdom, so to speak. Maybe I'll say that's not exactly the point. The point is that the essence, the essential element of the commandments are the same in this world as they are in the highest divine reality. But as they come down, they become physical as they emerge in this world. So this isn't something we can really fully understand. However, the fact is, a mitzvah is something that bridges the gap between God and the physical world. That's the point. And certainly between God, the undefined, and to the creation that's defined. And so that's why it can be the bridge between the soul and God. So the Torah, particularly the commandments, are garments. And it said that the Torah is like food. As King David says, and your Torah is within my digestive system. It's within my innards. So that's another meaning here. You could say possibly that's one of the allegories here that the priest is punished if he comes without any garments to serve in the temple. Is the idea before you approach holiness, you have to have good deeds. You can't come naked and try to come close to God, without good deeds. So that might explain one of the reasons that there's a custom, according to the Arizal, to give charity before prayer, to give some charity. And so that makes sense because that's our vestments. Our garments are the commandments such as charity, etc. So that maybe there's a connection there. There's another interesting point I wanted to mention. Well, there's several points. But first, since we're focusing on the garments, I wanted to mention that there's so many different points here that we can bring out. On the first of all, there was the breastplate, right? And the ephod was like an apron, but the apron came around over the shoulders, and there were two stones, and then there was the breastplate with the different stones for all the different. There was, I think it was 3 rows. Anyway, there was 12 stones. Yeah, so there were 4 rows of 3 stones each for the 12 tribes. And up here, there were 2 stones, 6 and 6. So I think it's quite obvious that this represented the idea of the love of Israel. First of all, that the priest needed to have a love because it's over the heart and over the chest, right? It's also here that might have represented the idea of carrying the burden of the Jewish people and the children of Israel also here in terms of bearing and patience with any difficulties that they may, for some reason, as they're going through their struggles to come closer to God. So, but I think that's representative, and that's another thing in prayer we have to do is accept upon ourselves the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, of love thy neighbor as thyself. And so the representative there's an idea that the priest has to, and we know this, that the priests have to bless the people, they have to love the people, and they're supposed to love the people, bless the people with love. So I think as a Noahide, we can we can learn something from this, that also that a Noahide, first of all, should encourage and increase in love of his fellow Bnei Noach, and in general of people at large, and forgive people, try to be understanding of people. Because their parallel is drawn to the responsibility of a Jew to love his fellow Jew. Within the Bnei Noach community, it's a communal idea where the Bnei Noach should act in a similar fashion to fellow Bnei Noach. And obviously, we still have to act properly to any human being. It's just that the idea of love is a step beyond. It's a step of self-sacrifice, going above and beyond treating them literally like they would be like yourself. So that's a whole other level. It's not just being kind. Certainly it's not just being honest and doing what's just. That has to be for everyone. And we even see that in terms into an idolater. We see that that when we tried to redeem a Jewish slave, an Israelite slave, from an idolater, we have to pay him appropriately, verses tell us in Leviticus. So we see from this, sages say that you see from this that, obviously that business dealings have to be done properly with anybody. So in other words, it's not an issue of giving a person their due. That's a given, that we have to give a person their due. The question is whether we have to go above and beyond for somebody. And that's the idea. Love thy neighbor as yourself is more than just what's coming to them in terms of justice. For example, if you owe someone money, you have to pay. That doesn't matter if it's a Jew or a Gentile, whoever it is, but or an idolater. When it comes to things like not charging interest, when it comes to things like, or things that are similar to, at least, forgiving a loan forgiveness, those are things that that's going to be appropriate to your brother. That's a higher level of relationship. Anyway, but the point is I guess the point is to meditate on God's love. Great care, I think, is the most obvious part. The truth is, the whole idea of love is a little amorphous. Like, what is love? What is love anyway? Like, the idea that we should have love. I know in Christianity they talk about that idea of love, but what is love? What's love? The idea that I think that the commandments are replaced by love, loving your neighbor. But what does it mean to love? What is it exactly? I mean, people can love and abuse their spouse and also love them simultaneously. I mean, so what is love good? Is love a good in its own right? And what is the love we're talking about when we're talking about, a love that encourages and generates peace and kindness and a spirit of generosity? Well, I guess I kind of answered my own question. That's the kind of love we're talking about. We're not talking about a self-centered kind of a love. We're talking about a love that springs out of or together with generosity, that springs together with a desire, a loving kindness to others. You know what it comes from? It comes from feeling loved. Someone cares for us. Then, and that's kind of what I was starting to say, is that a person should meditate on how much, to what a degree, God provides for all things. And again, like an average person really can't wrap their mind around it because we take everything for granted. But if you take nothing for granted, Instead, you start from scratch and realize how the whole world, the whole universe is developed in a way that we can live, that all the creatures on this planet can survive comfortably, that there's air, that there's water, that there's an abundance of so many things, and that everything is created in a way that they can survive. And even the fact that things pass away so that the species can continue and not overpopulate and so on and so forth. Everything in its right measure. But the point is specifically is to look at how God specifically provides for things. And makes beautiful things. I mean, one thing is that, like when you wake up in the morning and you see a sunrise, and everybody gets to enjoy that beautiful sunrise, even the worst people. And I mean, look how much beauty that God has given us for nothing, for free. I think we make more a mess of everything. We were just talking about when we started the class about how beautiful nature is, how pleasant it is to us, to our senses. And although sometimes nature can be harsh, you know, living in a homestead somewhere, you know, back in the 18-somethings, 1850s to 1890s, was not an easy thing to do, probably was pretty uncomfortable and really cold or really hot. But at the same time, there was a lot of things that could help people, give them some comfort. The wind and the sun, you know, and even the rain providing. So, I mean, I myself, I think there's so much more we can do to appreciate how much that we have and the things around us. But my point is that if we realize that the world is full of loving kindness, then that rubs off on you. Hopefully. If at least the person's soul can be awoken from that, then there'll be a good spirit. But if a person is self-centered, they're not going to feel anything. You have to open your eyes, you know, I guess open your heart to try to experience God, to find him out there in the natural world. And then you'll realize this point. If you look around only to see if you can get a suntan, you're not going to notice anything. I guarantee it. And actually that's also another Hasidic idea, is that the person has multiple souls in themselves. And when a person thinks selfish thoughts, so that means that the animal soul is active. When a person thinks holy and good thoughts, then the divine soul is active. So if the point is when we're thinking thoughts that are selfish, you're not going to have any sensitivity to divine things and to moral things, because that part of you is as sensitive to that is dormant. So it's very problematic. That's why it's important for a person to focus on good things as much as they can. So I think I got a little far afield here, but I was talking about the breastplate and how that's related to love. And so when we're talking about the service of God, particularly what is the service of God nowadays? Prayer. Person should fill their heart with love for first of all, for the Jewish people, for God's chosen people, and then also for mankind and for all creation. And that's, you know, I think the point we can take away from the breastplate. Every tribe is mentioned there, so that represents kind of the idea that we value each individual. They're all different, and people have different weaknesses, different strengths. You probably heard the famous story, which I always liked very much as a child. There's a story in the Talmud about a certain sage had completed a long period of study, and he was very, very happy. And I think he was riding a horse along the sea line, probably, you know, on the Mediterranean Sea line of the land of Israel. And there was a very ugly, poor-looking man that passed by him, and he said to him, and he passed him, and he said, "Peace upon you, my master, my rabbi, my master," as was a proper way to, address a rabbi. And I forget which rabbi this was, but the rabbi turned to him and he said to him, and this was, I think, because they're pointing out that he's there thinking about how much studying he's done, and then he said to this man who said hello to him, he said something like, "How did you become so unappealing, so ugly?" So the man responded to him. He said, "You don't like the way I look? Why didn't you take it up with who created me?" And the rabbi immediately realized that he did something really wrong. And he got off the horse and he started begging him for forgiveness, this man, and he wouldn't forgive him. And he kept on his knees all the way into town. And he kept asking him, and he wouldn't forgive him. And the townsfolk said to him, "You have to forgive him. He's a great teacher." And the man said, "If he's a great teacher, there shouldn't be like him in Israel." That's pretty much the end of the story as I remember it. Oh, I think there are those who say that this person was actually Elijah, who was testing him. In any event, there's a lot of things to learn from this story. Why am I bringing this story? I'm off track now. Why I brought this up? Why did I bring this up? Well, I guess the point that this man said, that go back to he who created me. And when we look at everyone and realize that they're God's creations, everything looks very, very different. We understand things very, very differently. I mean, obviously, the first lesson that I hear from this story is that the danger of spiritual accomplishment, that spiritual accomplishment can actually bring someone down, God forbid. We have to be very careful that spiritual accomplishments don't bring to pretension and arrogance. And that's what happened. There was like he was getting a little bit too happy with himself. And at that moment, he lost his sense of humility and reacted and lost his sense for that moment. lost his discipline, how should I say, and it was because of his lack of humility at that moment, because of what he was, soaking in his great accomplishment that happened. And that's why the Talmud tells us this story tells us that he just completed certain tractates, etc., so that we understand the connection between his completing this study and this failure that occurred. What's funny is I somehow through all this, I'm trying to remember what exactly. So Cheyenne says, if we study Torah without us learning to love, that seems to be missing the point. Yeah. But again, love is something that I don't know if you can necessarily automatically get it through Torah study. I think prayer actually may be a better method. Because again, the idea is meditating. Prayer goes together with the idea about meditating about God and meditating about, again, all the kindness that there is in the world that we can see, focusing on the positive. Okay. So the portion, the Torah portion begins with a discussion of the commandment of the oil needed for the candelabrum, for the menorah. And it says that the oil should be brought to Moses in order that it should be used by Aaron and his sons to, to light the candles in the temple. So first of all, why does this precede the story? Not the story. Why does it precede the commandments related to the priestly garments? It's smack in the middle. We were discussing the temple, and then suddenly there's this little bit about the oil, and then we go to the garments, and there's oil is discussed later on again. There's other things discussed later, but it seems to be out of place. For example, the incense is not mentioned here, but the oil is mentioned. What is it doing here? Seems a little out of place. So again, all of the Torah is printed for all generations. And again, how does this relate to us? What can we learn from this? So we know that the idea oil represents wisdom and enlightenment, intellect. Because the oil, you could say maybe the oil is really the deepest, the source. And the flame is actually what fills the room with light. And so the level of understanding of what's called Bina is the flame, and the oil is Chachma, is wisdom. So the cornerstone in wisdom from a Kabbalistic and a Hasidic point of view, wisdom is self-nullification. It's really brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant idea. First, you have to have self-nullification. That's the starting point. In other words, you have to be a student. You have to say, I want to learn. Your mind must be open to receive. If you already have preconceived notions that you refuse to abandon, then you're not a recipient. And you can't really accept any wisdom because it's all going to be twisted based on your own preconceived notions. So you're not receiving anything. All you're really doing is gaining new ammunition to support your own preconceived notions. So that isn't true learning. First thing we have to have is self-nullification. Person has to silence themselves. Then they can learn. Again, humility. First, they have to be humble enough to realize, I don't know, and I want to hear, and I accept, and my mind is open to receive. So you have to have another way of saying it. You have to have an empty vessel in order to fill it up with wine. You can't fill up a full vessel. So that means, in other words, over here in this context, in terms of the idea, is that a person first has to have fear of God. A person first has to have that element of self-nullification, has to stimulate their altruism, their sense of this isn't about me. This is about Torah. This is about what God wants. Take it from a very practical standpoint. To study Torah, the first thing really, to study it properly and truly, I'm sitting down, what is it? What is God's will? What is he saying here? What does God want to tell me? And want to hear what it is that God is teaching me, and it should filter all the way down into our actions, all the way down. It's not something academic. It's not something just interesting. Yeah, I'm here. I'm in control of my life. No, it's interesting to read this book. Okay, now I'll just go to Starbucks. That was interesting. No, it's supposed to be something that, it's like a king's edicts you read and you need to follow. And that it enters, it touches your heart, hopefully. A person can reach much, much higher levels of wisdom with self-nullification. Again, with the idea of, I'm here to listen and learn. And I accept God's wisdom and will. and I want to learn more. I accept what the righteous and the sages teach, and I want to be molded based on their understanding of the way human beings should be, as opposed to, kind of fitting the Torah into what's convenient for me, what I can use to justify my existence, etc., etc. That's an example of the Torah turning from an elixir of life into an elixir of death. The person uses the Torah to justify their own misdeeds somehow, for example, by focusing on certain commandments as opposed to others, or again, by causing them to be arrogant over other people. So then they turn the Torah into an elixir of death. Chas v'shalom, heaven forbid. Oh, there was something that I probably should have started with. I wanted to point out something very interesting in Psalms. We learned Psalms from there now. If you look at chapter 104, it says that God also has clothing, so to speak. And as it says in verse 1 and in verse 2, there it says, you have garbed yourself with majesty and splendor. You enwrap yourself with light as with a garment. Right? So even God, so to speak, manifests himself in a way with garments. Obviously, from a Kabbalistic perspective, this means different veils and different conduits in order to influence and radiate to all the realities and created beings, etc., etc. I guess it's another thing about clothing, by the way. It's a very, very important point, is what clothing. I don't think human beings could have gotten anywhere without clothing, because clothing is a manifestation of self-restraint. In other words, without clothing, our bodies are completely open, and so our bodily urges are more dominant. And obviously, other people are seeing our bodies as well, so there's also that present. But the way we function in the world is we cover that to minimize that. The reason this came to my mind is because the idea but with lahavdil, to distinguish between human beings and God. But God, as I just said before, there's an idea of he enwraps himself. But there's also, together with that, there's a contraction. There's a veil, but there's also a contraction of God's light, so to speak, of his radiance, of his influence, etc., however we can understand it. Like God moving outward, so to speak. There's a restraint. So when the first thing God did in order to create was self-restraint. That should be a tremendous lesson. We believe I think in modern society, there's a belief that the way you can have the most influence is by self-expression to the greatest extent. But in reality, no, it's a combination of self-expression and restraint. Not only self-expression. Self-expression alone can be very destructive. In other words, self-expression with abandon, that's it. Just let all your instincts go wild, that's it. No, person has to exercise restraint. And and restraint really is the greatest sign of strength in Jewish thinking, in Torah thinking, right? As it says, who is the brave and strong person? Person who controls his inclination. That's the bold, strong person. So that itself is a tremendous, tremendous lesson. It's not just telling us of what we have to do, but also how we have to look at ourselves and others. Who is the person who's really bold? Who's really strong? Is it the person who's the bully? Are they strong? Or is the person that is maybe people, how do I say, what's the expression? Maybe he's occasionally harassed. They don't say anything. They let it go. even though they can take action, and not out of weakness, not out of fear particularly. They're not doing it out of fear, but in order to keep peace, or in order, to control their own anger, etc. So no, so it's the person who doesn't respond who's actually stronger in a deeper, more real sense than the person who reacts. Depending on the circumstance, of course. Anyway, I've been talking a very long time. Is there any comments from the audience?